Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country.
On the morning of January 28, 1986, millions of Americans sat in front of their television sets, coffee in hand, expecting to watch something triumphant. Teachers had brought their classes into gymnasiums and auditoriums across the country. Kids sat cross-legged on cold tile floors, eyes fixed on tiny screens mounted high on metal brackets. What they were about to witness was supposed to be a celebration, a moment that would make them proud of their country, proud of science, proud of the idea that ordinary people could touch the sky. Instead, 73 seconds after liftoff, the sky cracked open. And nothing was ever the same again. Most people think they know this story. They know the name Christa McAuliffe, the teacher who never made it to space. They know about the O-rings. They know there was a disaster, an investigation, a moment of national grief. But the full story, the one buried in internal memos, suppressed by institutional silence, and pieced together only decades later, is far stranger, far darker, and far more human than anything that makes it into the history books. These are the things you probably didn't know about the Challenger disaster. And once you know them, you will not be able to look at a rocket launch the same way again. Before we talk about what happened in the sky, we need to talk about what happened in a conference room the night before. On January 27, 1986, engineers from Morton Thiokol, the private contractor that built the solid rocket boosters for the shuttle, held a tense, desperate phone call with NASA managers. These engineers were not panicking over nothing. They were armed with data, with charts, with years of post-flight analysis that showed a terrifying pattern. The colder the temperature at launch, the worse the damage to the rubber O-rings that sealed the joints of the rocket boosters. Roger Boisjoli, one of the most experienced SEAL specialists on the entire program, had been raising alarms since 1985. He had written a formal memo, not a casual email, not a whispered concern, but a documented, circulated internal memo, warning that the O-ring situation could lead to the loss of crew and vehicle if it was not addressed. That memo existed. It was read by people with the power to act. Nothing changed. On the night before the launch, when temperatures at Cape Canaveral were expected to drop below freezing, Boisjoli and his colleagues made one final attempt. They presented their data. They asked for a delay. They said, in plain terms, do not launch tomorrow. What happened next has become one of the most chilling moments in the history of institutional failure. A Morton Thiokol manager, under pressure from NASA officials who pushed back and demanded proof that the cold would cause a failure rather than proof that it was safe to fly, told the engineers to, in effect, stop thinking like engineers and start thinking like managers. The engineers were overruled by the people above them. The recommendation to delay was reversed. And the next morning, Challenger launched into air so cold that ice had formed on the launch pad overnight. Boisjoli watched from the ground. He knew what was coming. He could not stop it. Here is something that rarely makes it into the commemorations. In the 48 hours leading up to the launch, NASA had already postponed the mission twice. Once because of bad weather in Senegal, where an emergency landing site was located, and once because of a stuck bolt on a hatch handle that took hours to remove and then broke a drill bit in the process. These delays were frustrating for everyone involved. The mission had already been pushed back multiple times before that. The media was beginning to make jokes about it. NASA managers were acutely aware that the program's credibility and its budget depended on demonstrating that the shuttle could fly reliably and frequently. That pressure was not abstract. NASA had promised Congress and its military and commercial partners up to 24 flights per year. The shuttle was supposed to be the workhorse of American space ambition, reliable as an airline, capable of deploying satellites, conducting science experiments, and carrying the kind of civilian passengers that would make space feel accessible to ordinary people. By 1986, the program was falling badly behind that schedule. Challenger's 10th mission was supposed to help prove the shuttle could deliver. Every delay made that argument harder to sustain. What this created was an environment in which the instinct to launch was institutionally rewarded and the instinct to pause was treated as a kind of disloyalty. Engineers who raised concerns were not fired or punished in any dramatic, visible way. Instead, they were quietly sidelined. Their objections were reframed. Their data was reinterpreted. The culture at NASA, and at the contractors that depended on NASA contracts, had shifted from one that treated uncertainty as a reason to stop, to one that treated past success as permission to continue. Because the O-rings had been damaged before without catastrophic failure, managers convinced themselves that damage was acceptable. This is the phenomenon that sociologist Diane Vaughan would later famously describe as the normalization of deviance, the process by which organizations gradually come to treat dangerous anomalies as routine. It is a pattern that appears in nearly every major industrial disaster in history. It appeared at Challenger, and it was visible in the paperwork years before the shuttle ever left the ground. Most people who watched the disaster live believed they saw an explosion, a massive, sudden fireball that obliterated the shuttle in an instant. That image, the bright white bloom expanding against the blue Florida sky, became one of the defining photographs of the 20th century. But what actually happened was mechanically different, and in some ways more disturbing. 1 second after liftoff, a puff of gray smoke appeared near the lower joint of the right solid rocket booster. It was small, brief, and almost invisible at real-time speed. Cameras captured it. Analysts later identified it as the first sign that the O-ring seal had already failed, that cold-stiffened rubber had not expanded quickly enough to block the gap when the booster ignited. For a moment, a piece of debris lodged in that gap and temporarily plugged the leak. The shuttle kept climbing. For 63 seconds, everything appeared normal. Telemetry was flowing. The crew was calm. The vehicle was accelerating through the region of maximum aerodynamic stress exactly as planned. Then, at 64 seconds, the debris plug failed. A flame appeared near the strut connecting the right booster to the massive external fuel tank. It burned sideways, directly toward the thin aluminum wall of the hydrogen tank, cutting through it the way a welding torch cuts through sheet metal. The internal pressure of the tank began to collapse. At 73 seconds, the external tank ruptured. Liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen mixed violently and ignited, not in a single detonation, but in a massive, uncontrolled release of energy that dismembered the vehicle mid-air. The shuttle's main engines were still running when the structure failed. The solid rocket boosters, still burning at full thrust, separated from the disintegrating vehicle and flew on their own erratic, divergent paths, one of them performing a full cartwheel in the sky, until range safety officers on the ground triggered their self-destruct charges and blew them apart. The fireball that viewers saw on television was not the Challenger exploding. It was the propellants igniting in the atmosphere after the structure that contained them had already been torn apart. It was the aftermath, not the event. Now comes the part that makes people go silent when they hear it for the first time. When the Challenger's main structure disintegrated, the crew cabin did not. The forward section of the orbiter, the compartment where the 7 astronauts were seated, separated as a largely intact unit. It was thrown upward on the inertia of the vehicle's ascent, reaching a peak altitude of roughly 65,000 feet, before beginning a 2-minute, 45-second freefall toward the Atlantic Ocean. For years, NASA's public statements implied, without explicitly saying, that the crew had died instantly. The implication was merciful, but it was not accurate. Evidence recovered from the crew cabin during the subsequent salvage operation told a different story. 3 of the 7 personal egress air packs, small emergency devices that supply breathable air in the event of cabin smoke or depressurization, had been manually activated. These were not automated systems. They required a deliberate human action. Someone, in the seconds after the vehicle came apart, had the presence of mind to reach for those devices and turn them on. Additionally, investigators found that multiple cockpit switches had been moved from their standard launch positions to settings that would only make sense if someone were attempting to restore power or stabilize the cabin. One analyst specifically identified the movements as consistent with actions that pilot Mike Smith would have been trained to take in an emergency. Smith's station was in the right front seat, directly adjacent to the power control panel. The cabin itself remained structurally intact until it struck the surface of the Atlantic at more than 200 miles per hour. Forensic analysis confirmed that the final cause of death for all 7 crew members was the impact with the ocean, not the initial structural failure of the shuttle. The cabin hit the water approximately 2 minutes and 45 seconds after the vehicle broke apart. That is 165 seconds. It is not a long time in the abstract. In those circumstances, it was an eternity. NASA initially withheld the full details of the crew cabin's fate. The information emerged slowly, under pressure from congressional investigators and journalists who demanded access to the findings. Even today, the agency has never made a definitive public statement about precisely how long the crew may have remained conscious. The most that scientists can say with confidence is that a sudden depressurization at that altitude would have caused hypoxia, oxygen deprivation, within seconds to minutes, and that the astronauts may or may not have lost consciousness before impact. What is known for certain is that they did not die in the fireball. They fell. The story of Challenger did not end in 1986. In 2022, 36 years after the disaster, a dive team hired to film a documentary about World War II shipwrecks off the coast of Florida stumbled across something that didn't match anything from that era. Lying beneath layers of sand and seawater, partially buried but unmistakably intact, was a 20-foot section of the Challenger shuttle. The thermal tiles, those distinctive black heat shield tiles that were one of the shuttle's most recognizable features, were still clinging to the fuselage. The wreckage had been sitting on the ocean floor, undiscovered, for nearly 4 decades. NASA confirmed the find and formally identified the debris. Officials stated that the wreckage would be preserved in place out of respect for the crew and their families. But the discovery raised questions that many people had stopped thinking to ask. How much of the shuttle has never been found? The original recovery operation in 1986 retrieved roughly 47% of the orbiter's structure. More than half of it was never recovered. Some of that material is in deep water. Some of it may be buried under sediment. Some of it, apparently, was sitting in plain sight, or as plain as anything on the ocean floor can be, the entire time. The 2022 find also reignited a debate about transparency. Some investigators and family members had long believed that NASA had been less than fully open about the extent of the wreckage recovery and the locations where debris was known to rest. The sudden accidental surfacing of a major piece of the shuttle, found not by any government agency but by a commercial documentary crew, gave those concerns renewed weight. In 2003, 17 years after Challenger, another shuttle broke apart. Columbia disintegrated during re-entry, killing all 7 crew members aboard. The cause was a piece of foam insulation that had struck the leading edge of the left wing during launch, creating a hole through which superheated atmospheric gases penetrated during re-entry and destroyed the vehicle from the inside. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board, in its final report, used language that was startlingly familiar. It cited NASA's organizational culture. It described the normalization of risk. It noted that engineers had raised concerns about foam strikes during Columbia's mission, and that those concerns had been systematically undervalued by managers focused on schedule and mission success. The board explicitly stated that the organizational causes of the Columbia accident were rooted in the same NASA culture that produced Challenger. That sentence is one of the most important and most ignored sentences in the history of American aerospace. It means that the lessons of Challenger, lessons written in the deaths of 7 people, laid out in thousands of pages of investigation findings, repeated in documentaries and memorials and classroom curricula, had not been learned. Or rather, they had been learned, acknowledged, formalized, and then quietly set aside as the institutional pressures of running a complex, expensive, politically visible space program reasserted themselves. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable truth about the Challenger disaster. It was not simply a story about a bad O-ring or a cold morning in Florida. It was a story about the way large organizations process unwanted information, about the way hierarchies filter out the voices that most need to be heard, about the way success, perversely, makes organizations less safe rather than more, because each successful mission becomes evidence that the risks are manageable, about the way the people closest to the actual machinery, the engineers, the technicians, the specialists who understand in their bones what is happening inside a joint or a wing panel, can find themselves powerless when the institution decides it already knows what it needs to know. The 7 astronauts aboard Challenger, Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe, did not die because spaceflight is inherently unforgiving. They died because the system that was supposed to protect them had stopped listening to the people who understood the danger. They died because a rubber seal, known to be vulnerable, was never fixed. They died because a cold morning was not enough to overcome an institutional momentum that had its own logic, its own inertia, its own reasons for continuing. In 2024, a life-sized bronze statue of Krista McAuliffe was unveiled in New Hampshire. She is depicted mid-gesture, animated, full of the energy that made her the ideal representative of a program that wanted to show the world that space belonged to everyone. The statue is a fitting tribute. But the most fitting tribute, the one that honors not just McAuliffe but all 7 of them, is a refusal to simplify what happened to them. Their deaths were not an accident in the ordinary sense of the word. They were the product of choices. And choices can be made differently. The Challenger disaster is not a story about the limits of human ambition. It is a story about what happens when ambition is allowed to silence doubt. Every industry, every institution, every organization that